Madam President, I rise to speak on Senate Bill 474, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. This is a bipartisan bill, Madam President, that Senator Joe Manchin and I introduced some time ago. We've been working on this for a while now. And we intend to offer this legislation as an amendment to the pending legislation, the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. Our legislation, the bill that Senator Manchin and I have, is a common sense bill designed simply to protect children from child molesters, from predators who infiltrate our schools because they know that's where the kids are. And now the fact of the matter is the vast, overwhelming majority of school employees, we all know, are people who care very much about kids. It would never occur to them in a million years to do anything to harm the children in their care. But the fact is that there are pedophiles in our society, there are predators in our society, and they do, in fact, look to find opportunities where they will find their prey. And so we need protections against these people as they try to infiltrate our schools. These are protections, as I say, I've been fighting for some time now, and I'm not going to stop fighting until we get this done. There's lots of reasons to have this fight. For me, as for so many people, it's personal. I have 3 young children. They're 15, 13, and 5 years old. And when I send my kids to school in the morning and watch my child get on a school bus, I have every right to know that I'm sending my child somewhere where they can be safe, where they can be cared for, where they can be in the safest possible environment. And you know what, Madam President? Every other parent deserves that too. Every parent across Pennsylvania, every parent across America. And unfortunately, too many children and too many families have discovered this is not always the case. The horrific story that brought my attention to this cause and my passion for this was a story about a little boy named Jeremy Bell. And that story begins in Pennsylvania. It begins in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. One of the school teachers was molesting boys. He was a serial pedophile. He raped a boy. School officials discovered what was going on. They brought it to the attention of law enforcement, but the law enforcement authorities never had enough strong evidence to make a successful criminal case. The school decided they would dismiss the teacher for sexually abusing his students, but appallingly, the school also helped this teacher get a new job in West Virginia, where he became a teacher, in part because he got a letter of recommendation from the school that knew he was preying on their students. But they wanted him to be someone else's problem. So they gave him a letter of recommendation. He went to a new school in a nearby state, eventually became a principal. But along the way, of course, he continued his ways, culminating in the rape and murder of a 12-year-old boy named Jeremy Bell. Well, Madam President, justice did finally catch up with that monster. He's now in jail serving a life sentence for the murder of Jeremy Bell. But for Jeremy Bell, that justice came too late. And we'd like to think that this is a bizarre and isolated event that could never happen again. Unfortunately, that's not the case either. Last year alone, there were 459 school employees arrested across America for sexual misconduct with the children they're supposed to be taking care of. 459. And those are the ones where there was enough of a case that the arrest was actually made. It's more than one per day. 26 of them were in my state of Pennsylvania. And sadly, Madam President, we're halfway through 2015 now, and we're doing even worse. In the first half of 2015, there have been 265 such arrests. We're on pace to have well over 500 school employees across America arrested for sexual misconduct with the children they're supposed to be taking care of. And every single one of these stories has a terrible tragedy at the center. A little girl whose sexual abuse began at age 10 and only ended when at 17 years old, she found herself pregnant with the teacher's child. A teacher's aide who raped a young mentally disabled boy in his care. Kindergarten teacher who kept the child during recess and forced her to perform sexual acts on him. This is hard stuff to talk about, Madam President, but that doesn't make it go away. I think we need to confront it, and the cases are too many to ignore. So Senator Manchin and I decided it's time for Congress to act, to do something to make it more difficult for these predators to carry out these appalling acts. And so we introduced the Protecting Students Act, and it has two important goals, two protections designed to prevent convicted sex offenders from infiltrating our country's schools. The first is a standard background check process that will catch those who've been convicted. And the second feature in our legislation would end this terrible practice we saw in the Jeremy Bell case, the practice of a school knowingly helping a child molester find employment in a new school. That's a practice that's called passing the trash. Now, both of these provisions, both of these ideas have very broad bipartisan support. Madam President, the House of Representatives unanimously passed a bill that includes both of these protections last Congress. And just last fall, Congress voted 523-1. Both houses combined voted unanimously with only one dissenting voice on an even more expansive background check language that was enacted in the Child Care Development Block Grant that we all voted for, 523-1. In addition, our legislation, Senator Manchin's and mine, the Protecting Students Act, has been endorsed by numerous organizations in various categories. First of all kinds of child protection groups, the National Children's Alliance, which oversees the nation's child advocacy centers, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, the Children's Defense Fund, the Pennsylvania Partnership for Children. Law enforcement organizations overwhelmingly support our legislation. The National Association of Police Organizations, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, prosecutors support Senator Manchin and my bill. The Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the National District Attorneys Association have both endorsed the bill. The medical professionals at the American Academy of Pediatrics, Pennsylvania School Board Association, all endorsed this legislation. And as I said, it has two essential features, two ways in which we'd be protecting our kids. The first is the criminal background check. And let me be clear, every state in the union performs some kind of background check already. That's true, that's a fact. The problem is many of them are woefully inadequate. For instance, there's several states that fail to check all the school workers. They check teachers, for instance, but not non-teachers. And others will check certain criminal databases, but they won't check others, and so they miss convictions. Well, our legislation, the Protecting Students Act, requires that if a school wants to accept federal funds, it has to perform background checks on all adult workers who have unsupervised access to children. That would be both new hires and existing employees. And many states have only recently adopted background check policies, and many of the employees they have were hired before they put the background check policy in place. So many of these employees were never subject to a background check. Consider the case of 64-year-old William Vahey, who taught for decades across America and across the globe at some of the world's most elite schools. He would give his young students Oreo cookies laced with narcotics. And while the boys slept, the teacher molested them and photographed them. Scores of children were sexually abused. This teacher had been convicted for sexual abuse of children in California when he was in his 20s. But he was hired before many states had background check requirements, and therefore he was grandfathered into the system. The Protecting Students Act ensures that convicted sex offenders like William Vahey will be discovered, and they won't be hired. It also would include contractors. There are 12 states that don't require background checks for contractors at all. Now, this fact recently gave Montana parents a rude awakening, An audit of Montana's bus drivers found that 123 drivers had criminal histories, including one driver whose conviction landed him on the sexual and violent offenders registry, and one with an outstanding arrest warrant. And running the checks is only really helpful if the checks are thorough enough to find all convictions. So our legislation would require the 4 major databases to be checked: the FBI fingerprint check in the National Crime Information Center database, the National Sex Offender Registry established by the Adam Walsh Act, the State Criminal Registry, and State Child Abuse and Neglect registries. So these background check requirements constitute the first part of our bill. And as I said, this was passed unanimously in the House. I wouldn't think this would be controversial. But the second part of our bill is equally important, and that's the part that precludes passing the trash. It addresses the terrible acts that led to and made it possible for little Jeremy Bell to be raped and murdered. What this provision says is, if a school wishes to receive federal funds, the school may not knowingly help a child molester obtain a new teaching job. I would think this would not be controversial. And the practice, as I alluded to before, has become so common, sadly, it has its own moniker. It's called passing the trash. And it's become all too prevalent. I see the senator from Tennessee would like to address the body, and so I'm prepared to.
Would the senator yield for a moment?
I would be prepared to yield
for the purpose of